Okay, so for those who are watching, I have Father Appelhanz on today to talk about his article from the Reign of Mary. I don't know how many people probably know about the Reign of Mary, but I'm sure some do. But I'm going to advertise it real quick. So, for those who don't know, the Reign of Mary, it's a CMRI publication, and I recommend it. I mean, it had a lot of great articles. I've noticed in throughout some of the pages, they'll have like recommended readings for the month, spiritual readings. They have different articles on just spiritual things, and then also stuff going on with the crisis in the church too. So you can find the Reign of Mary on the CMRI website. I get no sponsor for this. I just really like doing magazine. And the article that Father Appelhanz we're going to talk about today is in the most current. I think it's the most current one, the number 9194. It shows fall of 2024. I don't think I've gotten another one, so I think this is the most current. This one here. So go check it out. I've been getting this art magazine for many years. I think even before I would consider myself Sedevacantist. I think, well, I was like Sedevacantist friendly, maybe. I've been getting the magazine. I've always really liked it. So, the article that Father Appelhanz talked about is tips for Sedevacantist apologists. I think 12 tips for Sedevacantist apologists. Maybe Father Appelhanz, you can, before we get into your article, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're located, and the chapel you're at, and so forth.
Yes, so I am located at Most Holy Rosary Catholic Church in Middleville, Michigan. So it's a small town in Michigan. It's about a half hour or so south of Grand Rapids, Michigan, so on the western side of the state. So I've been here since December of 2019, when I was ordained a priest. For the first few months of my priesthood, I resided primarily in Wayne, Michigan, with Father Francisco Radecki, and would travel here on Sundays to offer Mass. But I ended up becoming the resident priest here in March of 2020 once COVID hit. And so I'm the resident priest here, and then we have, I would say, approximately 80 to 90 parishioners. And we also have a small school, St. Philomena's Academy, that's run by the CMRI sisters. So there are 2 sisters stationed here at our parish. And I myself teach the high school classes, while the sisters teach the middle school. So I reside here, and then I also run 2 other missions. So on Sunday, after having Mass here, I travel to northwestern Illinois, where I have Mass at Our Lady of Lourdes Mission in Milledgeville, Illinois, a very, very small town. It's one of those missions where many people from quite a radius around it travel to, you might say, meet in the center. So we have a small mission there. I would say about 25 to 30 people though oftentimes it can vary how many make it on a particular Sunday, as some people come from sometimes up to 2 to 3 hours away.
Hey, Father, those missions that you're mentioning, are they advertised or whatever? Let's say, because I know let's say the Reign of Mary magazine that I was showing has a directory of all the different chapels. Are those missions? Excuse me, are they located on there or?
Yes, they are.
Okay, because I know
they're listed on there.
Because I know the mission where my priest come up to for a while wasn't mentioned. Now it's mentioned. So I know, maybe I'm just mentioning this for some people. There may be some missions that maybe not, they're like fairly new and they haven't been put into, they're not put in some type of directory. So it's always good if people are looking for a chapel, that they may have a chapel somewhere near them that they might not know about, or like a mission chapel that they may not know about that hasn't yet been put up there. in the directory or whatnot. I was surprised that they were coming up to near where I live. And they just recently started putting it into their directories, but for a while they've been coming up and hadn't been up there. So it just throw out there. If people are looking for a chapel, they can maybe get a hold of one of the CMRI chapels and just ask or whatever, see if there's anything near them. You never know.
Well, and on that point, I would say, I mean, if anyone is looking for a Mass center, you can always feel free to email me, as I am aware of pretty much everywhere in the United States where there are valid traditional priests offering Mass, whether with the CMRI or with various other traditional groups. So if anyone is in need to know where the current or the closest Mass to them is, you can always feel free to email me and I'll get back to you and let you know what the closest option for you is.
Yeah, that's always nice. I know my priest as well. They have a wealth of knowledge on that kind of stuff. Instead of always having to try to find it yourselves, you can just ask them, "Hey, I'm going here. What do you think about?" Or even if you have questions about a chapel you're not sure of, those are always good. Yep. Good to talk to. Oh, okay, Father. Thanks. Why don't we just get?
I was actually going to briefly mention as well, and then on Mondays I actually run a second mission. So I run a mission in the small town of Grant Park, Illinois. So it's near Kankakee, Illinois. It'd be Our Lady Queen of Apostles mission, which is a very recent mission. I only started going there just over a year, so probably about 15 months or so.
Mm-hmm.
So there's about 15 to 20 people there, depending on who can make it on a given day. Sometimes not everyone can make it due to it being on a Monday currently.
Yeah.
Ends up being about an hour south of the Chicago area.
Okay. Yeah. The mission right down from my house is they meet on a Monday and then a Tuesday. The priest stays overnight. Otherwise, I drive a couple hours down to the chapel on a Sunday. So that's cool. I was going to ask you, is at your main chapel where you're at, are you the only priest there?
Yes, I'm the only priest here.
And then Father Radecki is not. How far is he from you? Where you're at? I know he's in Michigan as well.
So he's about 2 hours east of me. So he's on the eastern side of the state. So I'm the only priest in Southwest Michigan. That most traditional clergy in Michigan end up being on either the eastern side, more your Detroit area, mm-hmm. or up north a bit more.
So this is just a geography question. So is Michigan like about just a couple hours wide? Is it?
Yes, it probably takes about 2.5 to 3 hours to drive across it. If you were to start from Lake Michigan and go east at about its widest point.
Okay.
At least for the bottom part, but then the upper peninsula is of course very long but not very wide. So
no, that seems so different.
Longer to drive across.
That seems so different from here. California's like, man, it might take like a day and a half, 2 days to drive up. Yeah, I don't even know. And then wide-wise is fast. So like when you tell me it's like he's only 2 hours away, I'm like, oh, he's like your neighbor. It sounds like to me. Anyway, okay, so let's get into your article, Father. You say your articles are the 12 tips of Sedevacantist Apologists. 12 tips for Sedevacantist Apologists. What was it that prompted you to write this? How did you go about getting this article in the magazine, and what motivated you to what brought this about?
Well, so one thing about myself is one of the things I do is kind of an extra thing to help out, as I am on social media quite a bit, specifically Facebook. In fact, I'm one of the moderators on a large Sedevacantist group, you might say, on Facebook.
Okay.
And so especially from doing that, I've seen so many people who truly have a great love for their Catholic faith and really want to help share it with others. But at the same time, I see too often people making what I would consider very stupid little mistakes that end up hurting that endeavor. And not even doing it deliberately by any means, but just little, I don't know, pitfalls, you might say, that people end up getting into that I fear hurts how much good ends up practically being done.
Hmm.
And it's been something that had been on my mind for some time, and I had discussed the matter with another one of my fellow priests, and he thought it would be a good idea to put out some kind of article or something, just kind of going through some of the things I had been noticing and that he had noticed as well. I discussed the matter with several different priests to kind of get their feedback on what they see, whether on social media or in their own parishes, and that, to try to get a general collection of the more common issues I see and with people trying to navigate through the traditional movement.
Do you find that? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I eventually ended up narrowing them down to 12, which I thought was appropriate in honor of the 12 apostles.
Do you find, Father, that this, or do you think that your points, whatever, it's geared specifically toward Sedevacantist apologists, or just maybe just doing apologetics in general? What would you say?
It's geared, I think, specifically towards people who are trying to make the case for Sedevacantism, although many of the points that I give would apply to any kind of apologetics, whether you're trying to work with people who are Protestants, Orthodox, you name it. That some of them are pretty general, but it was specifically geared towards people who are looking to teach others about Sedevacantism.
What you mentioned some of they might do some kind of stupid things or whatnot. What were some of those things that you were specifically you were thinking about when you were writing that article?
I think if you were to give in general, I think just perhaps sometimes the way traditional Catholics come across, I think too often people unintentionally come across as being arrogant or a little bit of a know-it-all attitude,
Mm-hmm.
or perhaps very quick towards things like name calling. So it's things like that. And then also I see a lot of mixing emotion too much into the discussion, arguing from a point of emotion a bit too much, which is sometimes interesting, as that's what a lot of people complain that people who defend the Novus Ordo end up doing. And it's very true. Too often, in fact, I'd say perhaps even the majority of the time, that's what people who defend the Novus Ordo end up doing. But at the same time, I sometimes see Sedevacantists do the same thing, at least to a certain extent.
Okay. Well, one of the points you mentioned in the article, one of the tips or points you mentioned in the article was arguing from emotion. I think that was
Yes.
Since we're talking about that right now, maybe you can tell me what is it? Maybe some example of what you're talking about that maybe a Sede apologist might, or someone who's trying to defend the Sedevacantist position. What do you mean by that when they say they're arguing from emotional standpoint or whatnot?
So I think it often comes in the vein of, you might say, like, how can you be so blind? Like, you're all a bunch of idiots. Why can't you see it? And yes, sometimes that is the feeling that goes through your head when you've given all the proofs and it doesn't seem like you've went anywhere. That it is a very easy feeling to have, but you have to be careful to not let that influence the way you then start going about it. Because I see quite often where people do start by giving very logical steps to the proof of Sedevacantism, and then when the person doesn't immediately get it, it then becomes this emotional argument.
So I think it's I think it's easy to forget, man, like that it takes time for people
Yes.
to like progress into particular, take the logical progression a certain way. Uh, I mean, it's easy to, I mean, I find myself, I'm not always necessarily doing apologetics for Sedevacantist so much, but occasionally I might, but I'm usually, like you say, attacking Protestants. And I see myself doing that too, coming as a former Protestant myself. I was ordained in the Presbyterian Church in America back in the day. And I see myself going, what's wrong with you? Like, how can you not, Okay, so I can see myself as well being like, since I'm been so immersed in Catholic thinking now for so long, now it just seems so clear to me. It's hard for me to want to go. I can understand that. So sometimes what you're saying is we got to just be a little more understanding, I guess.
Yes. And that's why two of my other points are one, which I labeled a no one to stop, which I think is a very important factor because it's very easy to overload people with information. Even, like I said, not even deliberately trying, because there's simply so much that has to be gone over. But to think on the standpoint of the poor person, the Novus Ordo, especially if they've lived it their whole lives, you're basically telling them their whole life was a lie in a certain sense. That the religion they thought was Catholic actually is not. But that's quite a thing for people to process.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it takes time. And so you don't want to overload them. That's why you want to always focus on the most essential parts first. And then another point I bring up in the article is to give people good references, good things to read or watch or listen to, so that they can go through those things at their own pace, that they can take the time to let it digest and sink in.
Father, the 12 tips that you put in this article, what did you find what would you say are the most, if you were to emphasize any one of them, like what would be the most important, or at least something that people should grasp right, that were on the front of your mind when you were writing this article, would you say?
I think the most important one was the one I put at number one. The rest were not in any particular order. But the first one being prayer and sacrifice for the conversion of sinners. That always has to take the first place, because at the end of the day, we cannot give people the grace of conversion. That's something that comes from God himself. He wishes often to use us as his instruments, but the grace has to come from him.
Yeah.
And so we need to ask Almighty God to send people those graces. That's why you see with so many of our Blessed Mother's apparitions, whether at Lourdes or at Fatima, what have you, that she always emphasized that prayer and penance for the conversion of sinners, because that's what people need first and foremost. And that's why it's interesting when you see in many accounts of the missionaries when they'd go into pagan lands, that often one of the projects they would try to get started first was to have a monastery or a convent built for cloistered religious. So religious who would live their entire lives at that monastery or convent, simply doing prayer and sacrifice. They didn't have an external apostolate of preaching to the people, traveling, etc. And for some, that might seem at first glance to be not the correct way. That it would seem at first glance that we need more people out there in the fight, you might say, out there preaching and all that. But the focus was to have people who were there to pray and sacrifice for the success of the missionaries. And quite often, much of the success of the missionaries had to do with those convents or monasteries that were founded, those monks or nuns praying and sacrificing each day. And so that's something that's such an important thing, and also something that each person can do. That it doesn't matter what whether you're rich or poor, whether you're a talented leader or not, that no matter what state or condition you're in, you can always pray and you can always offer sacrifice. That the most important thing is something that everyone can be doing.
I think that's interesting. So the monks would go in there almost like they're like tilling the soil and getting it ready for when they start planting the seeds. That's kind of an analogy. That's interesting. When you're talking about the apologetic stuff that you're saying, you're talking primarily online, correct? I know
It was
in my real life, I'm not really in my real life, normal life, I'm not really interacting much. I'm not having these conversations with, you could say real like people like people I interact with on a daily basis. I mean, it's mainly, I think that's what seems like a lot of the apologetics takes place. Would you say?
I would say so these days. It was primarily written for people online, but the principles given work either way, whether you're dealing with someone online or whether you're dealing with them in person, that the same principles would apply either way. But yes, especially in these days, I do find that a lot of that work does occur online because almost all of humanity is on social media.
Sure.
And it does have the benefit of being able to share a lot of information very quickly and very easily.
So I'm just thinking by myself too, and others. Maybe we're engaging online with people. You're saying like it's important that we just have a prayerful and sacrificial attitude when we're engaging with people, praying, as opposed to just, I don't know, just trying to get our punches in. It sounds like.
Yes, that generally, if you're not living a good Catholic life, don't expect to have much success.
Right. So go ahead.
Because even with like the missionaries, you can think of like the great missionary saints like Saint Francis Xavier, that they would labor all day, but then they would spend much of their night in prayer. That prayer has to be that place of strength for us, that place where we go to get those necessary graces. And the same goes for when it comes to living a good life. One of the points I make in the article is to always set a good example. And for that one, I was thinking, especially online, that I've seen far too many examples of traditional Catholics who post stuff that is actually very scandalous. I'm thinking especially in the areas of modesty, posting pictures of themselves or their children or others who are dressed oftentimes very immodestly. And then sometimes the type of language that is used, that whether very
I agree.
language towards others or just very vulgar language or things like that.
Yeah,
That will really help to undermine what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that, especially on I'm not on Facebook, but I am on X, and I do see a lot of that. It does kind of surprise me, and I do see a lot of, like, I don't know if Father, you're not on X, are you?
No, I've heard how much of a war zone X can be in the traditional movement. So I stick with Facebook. It's a little bit calmer atmosphere.
Yeah. So, and X too. One thing about X is that, speaking of the modesty issue you're referring to, is we're trying to promote the Sedevacantist position, the traditional Catholic position, whatever, and then we're retweeting or highlighting just things that are just completely immodest. I think that's a good point. I think it's good to just watch what we're retweeting or what we're even commenting on, because if you're subscribed to other people, if you're subscribed to others and they're commenting on something that's completely immoral, immodest or whatever, and you're subscribed to, you see their comment, and you see what they're commenting too, and you're like, why are we even? Why is this even? It does undermine. I mean, it goes back to I think the first point of prayer and being sacrificial. That it probably just hurts our own spiritual life to be even engaging with something totally immodest and immoral, just to point it out that it's immodest and immoral. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I think setting that good example. Some of the language, I don't know, it's not helpful.
No, well,
Yeah.
it definitely is not helpful. I mean, if you're going about insulting your opponent, you're not going to get anywhere with him. That there is a way to be kind to others while at the same time remaining firm. And
Okay, so that's
too often people mess up a bit, that they ignore the charity part.
now maybe there might be people, myself including, that are like, okay, I get that because we should do that, but you get what about the how do we engage, or should we engage with those that are just, I don't know, they don't have any good, they don't have a good attitude toward us. Maybe the common thing I hear all the time that I don't know if I could say irritates me would be calling us Protestants. Studies are just Protestant. Like, that's so low IQ, low energy thing to say, right, that I'm like, I'm willing to like slit the throat, if you could say, apologetically, of the person. I'm quick to do that. Like, I'll be quick to do that. So I don't know if I'm quick to, I have no mercy when I hear things like that in my mind, because it irritates me. So, not that I'm saying that's right, but I'm quick to like apologetically stab the person, if that makes sense. Like cut their argument down without any kind of like gentleness. But so when we see these kind of things, and there's a lot of that, and I'm sure we're also guilty of doing the same thing by being low IQ, attacking on, let's say, the R&Rs or the Novus Ordos. When we see these people kind of engaging this, what I think I'm sure this applies to one of your points. I'm trying to remember. Maybe know when to stop. Maybe it could be on there. What should be our attitude in that regard? If someone just just wants to just kind of do a quick attack on us, or just we're engaging and they say something that is just so belittling of the position. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, so I think it's in many ways going to depend on if this is a repeat thing or if it's more of a first time. Because with many people, they're simply echoing what they've been taught.
Mm.
And so I would think for someone like that, what I myself would do would be to very clearly and just very matter of fact show that particular claim is false without using any belittling language towards the person. Just make it very matter of fact. Just let the evidence speak for itself. But if after doing that, if you have the same person continually attacking you with the same things, at that point, don't even waste your time arguing with them, because if the person's not willing to even consider what you're saying, you're not going to get anywhere with them anyway. That if the person doesn't want to be helped, there becomes little you can do for them besides obviously praying and sacrificing for them. Yes, you want to always do it, like I said, very matter of fact. Let the evidence speak for itself, but especially avoid, like I said, the name calling. That too often the name calling ends up becoming an issue. And I think part of it ends up being is when you're on social media, you're not interacting face to face with a person. And because I see this one very often where I think people misinterpret what the other person said, because you have only the bare words of what they said. You don't know what tone they're meaning to say it in and all that. That because there's no face-to-face interaction, it can be very easy to misinterpret certain things. And also because you're not face-to-face with someone, there can be much easier to say things that you would not really want to say if you were face-to-face with the person.
This actually thinks maybe of a I don't know if this is a point, but maybe a point that could be used is when when you're interacting online, is to always remember that there's a real person there.
Right. There's a real person and a soul that God loves and that needs to be saved. That's important to keep that in mind, because it's like, yes, we all know that, but I think people should take a little bit of time to remind yourself of that, and it'd be a very good means to help be more charitable. I can think of, for example, of the famous quote of St. Francis de Sales that you'll attract more flies with a spoonful of honey than with a barrel of vinegar. And St. Francis de Sales, I believe, can help convert thousands of Protestants back to the true faith. So if there's anyone who knew what he was talking about, it was St. Francis de Sales.
Absolutely. I know you said there wasn't any particular order in your article here on tips for steady apologists, but the second one I felt like it would be naturally flow, which is on knowing your Catholic faith well.
Correct. Yeah. That's a very big one, because that's another one too often. I see people who, at least I have reason to fear, don't fully know what they're talking about, which ends up being a problem, especially if they end up interacting with someone who at least knows the rudiments of the Catholic faith better than they do, that they can end up getting beaten in an argument very easily. Or, of course, the worst aspect being the fear that they may tell the person something that's actually incorrect. And that's one you run into. Like I said, once again, not even dealing with people who are deliberately doing it. That people, because my article was written for people who are generally trying to do the right thing. That it was not written for people who, of course, are trying to undermine the Catholic faith in any way.
Sure.
Nor was it really written for people whose pretty much seem to be their whole goal in life is to just fight with people. Because unfortunately, I find too many of those people, you're not going to convince them to either way. That's written for people who are, like I said, truly trying to help share the faith. And there is such a great need for that.
Yeah.
And so to help people like that. But yes, especially knowing, like I said, knowing your faith well. And so if someone doesn't know their faith quite as well yet, that you want to take some time to learn it well before, I would say, heavily engaging with people.
I think, and related to that, it seems like it's a common thing, maybe, or maybe new converts can tend to be zealous, and
yes.
And I wonder if there's like a time period that people should, that like, who come to the Sedevacantist position, if they should just take some time, like, like before they're so excited about what they learned or what they figured out, or they're just, I don't know, they want to go and just, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that idea of just, I don't know, the zeal of the new convert and how that it might apply?
Right, because oftentimes, as the saying goes, new converts make the best Catholics, because they usually are the ones who, on average, end up being the most zealous. Not always by any case, but you do see that quite often. And so, yes, there's going to be that natural desire to share what they've learned with others. And that is something that is very good and very praiseworthy. But at the same time, you do want to make sure you do know your faith well. And that's why for any new convert, I would recommend going through the even the basic catechism again, even if you may have went through it in the Novus Ordo or whatnot, if you had a more conservative foundation, if the place you're at was a bit more conservative, but I'd still recommend to go through it again. Because that's actually one interesting point, that too often if people don't keep up on studying their Catholic faith, they end up forgetting sometimes very basic things. And so you want to always keep that fresh in your head, whether you've been a Catholic for 6 months or 60 years. And there's, of course, always more that we can be learning about our Catholic faith. But as for a particular time frame, I don't think you could really give one. It's going to depend on the particular person, because you can have converts who, especially if they've been doing a lot of heavy studying on their own beforehand, already know things pretty well.
Mm.
Or you can have ones who don't know as much. That you can have quite the range of people. And it really, whether they're a convert or not, even if they were born and raised Catholic, you have quite a range of how well a person knows their faith. And so you want
Father,
to
it would. Oh, go,
sure
sorry.
you know the basics. And then I would especially emphasize the point. If someone ever asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, make sure you look it up. Don't just take a random guess, because that can be disastrous. Then it goes back into always looking at or having good sources that you can go to for a reference, as well as good sources that you can recommend to people, that you can show them or give them, where they themselves can do their own research, and also see that you're not just making it up, that you want to show them the evidence of what you're saying, because otherwise it just becomes a he said, she said thing.
Father, in light of that, I'm talking about knowing your faith and whatnot. Some of the other 2 points you have kind of relate to this. Maybe what do you think? One of them was don't go off on tangents. Just kind of stick, maybe it sounds like you're kind of focus your points. What are some of the main points that Sedevacantists should focus on when maybe discussing this issue? Do you think, what are some key points that they should just kind of really head on without having to go into all the weeds? What would you say?
I would think some of the main ones would, of course, be anything, of course, first of all, to show that what the Catholic Church taught before Vatican II and what Vatican II has taught are totally different. That's showing that there is an actual contradiction, because that's one you often hear in the Novus Ordo. We just have to interpret Vatican II correctly, that it's all about how certain evil bishops have interpreted it.
Right.
When that's actually not the case. The documents themselves of Vatican II are heretical. So that's one major point. Obviously, another one being on the Novus Ordo Mass, showing that it is not valid, and that this is, once again, is not what was done by the Catholic Church before Vatican II. So those being the main points. And then I would also say as well, showing that the Pope cannot be a public heretic, because in many ways that ends up being the question that people focus on.
Yeah.
Because most people realize that in many ways that is the central question. If Francis is not the Pope, as well as his 5 predecessors of unhappy memory, that if these people are not the Pope, then the things they have approved in that are simply not approved. And so that's why that papacy question is so central, and why it's so important to show people that it is not possible for the Pope to be a public heretic. That is something that is simply not possible by our Catholic faith. because, of course, that's why we have such an issue these days with the recognize and resist community, where it's pretty much their belief is someone like Francis is the Pope, but in practice, it doesn't really matter because we, the individuals, get to pick and choose what we think is Catholic and what is not. And that's what happens in practice, is that you pick and choose whether you think this comes from God or whether this comes from the devil, although they're both coming from the same person. That with the recognize and resist, of course, it ends up in practice making the individual person his or her own pope, which is totally erroneous. Because if that's the case, then really in practice, how are we that much different from Protestants, really? Because Protestants believe they can interpret the Bible in that however they want. That you, in a sense, almost do the same thing with the Catholic faith, that you get to choose whether this is something to follow or not. That obedience to the Pope is thrown out the window. That the Pope ends up being, in practice, really a figurehead to these people. That he's there, you have a nice picture of him in your vestibule, you put his name in the canon, you say prayers for him, which everyone should regardless, because these anti-popes need many prayers, or because if they die in the state they are in, it's not going to be good for them. These are people that are actively working to destroy the Catholic faith. But yeah, with the R&R, you have this, he's there as a figurehead, but we certainly don't have to listen to him. But that's apparently totally optional for them.
Yeah, it does seem that, I mean, yeah, it does seem that they look at him that, I mean, obviously they're not going to say that, but like they do seem to have because they recognize the problems. Okay, they recognize the problem, but then they are willing to say that this man who's a pope could actually promote heretical and errors and things that are harming to souls. It is a weird position. I mean, but one of the things that I found easy, or at least that I usually try to bring up when North Sotos would mention, you should submit to Francis or whatever. I mentioned I find it the easiest and seem most out there is the ecumenical issue of Francis praying with false religions and going to doing all the things that were considered mortal sins against the faith. It's like, that I was just that's the easiest for me. That's always been the easiest to just say, well, am I free? Is it okay if I want to gather Buddhists and Hindus together at my house or whatever and pray together with them? Is that a holy and saintly activity?
Right, because the false ecumenism is one of the most glaringly obvious errors of the new religion, even to the casual observer. That why did our Lord found a religion if we don't have to actually belong to it? I mean, can you imagine if the Jews in the Old Testament followed that logic? When Moses went up to Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments, the first commandment being, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me. And then when he came down to the mountain and saw the Jews worshiping the golden calf, if you follow Novus Ordo logic, that should have been just fine. Moses should have joined right in with them.
He should have learned it and decide to accompany them.
Yes, it makes no sense.
No.
But because yes, that's something that is so blatantly obvious. It's so in your face that they do that. I mean, you can see pictures of Francis and his fellow cronies worshiping that horrific Pachamama statue in Vatican Gardens. Think of the famous pictures of John Paul II kissing the Quran.
I mean, even
what mark of Shiva on his forehead, etc., etc., etc.
I mean, one of the most glaring, I don't know how many people are aware of it, is when Francis went to Canada to do whatever he was doing,
Yes.
and he had that smudging ceremony, and he was going along with the leader of that, whoever's leading the smudging ritual. He's following the procedures that he's doing. He's like, put your hand over heart and pray to whatever they're doing. Him and all their fake bishops are all doing that. Like,
Yeah, wearing his nice Indian headdress.
Like,
because that's actually that brings up an interesting point that I would bring up, and I think it's one I actually forgot to put in my article, is a helpful tip when discussing these matters with others is this well-known saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen quite often it's the picture evidence for these things is often one of the most powerful arguments.
Yeah.
So I remember I had this with a particular family I met with in the Chicago area. The one traditional Catholic, her children were at least curious enough to hear what I had to say. And so I printed out pictures of like Francis worshiping Pachamama, kissing the Quran, praying at the Wailing Wall, those type of things. And I had them there so that people could look at. And I could tell that was the argument I made that hit home the most, or at least as far as I could tell, judging by people's facial reactions and that was the one that really brought it home. And I've heard of other priests mentioning when they've shown that to people that at first people just believe it has to be faked, that there's no way that could be true.
It seems like if you mention, because if you just mention, hey, he participated in this smudging ritual, or he's participated in this or that, and they're like, oh yeah, right. And then you show the video, like, is this something I should do as a, that I think it hits home. Like a lot of times when this is when they use the Protestant argument, say, oh, you guys are just like Luther. You're like Luther. And I show Francis, having pictures of Luther up and giving a stamp approved of Luther, and going to the Lutheran church and talking about how wonderful Luther was. I'm like, what's the disconnect? Why are you calling me a Protestant? Like, why are you,
Right,
showing these things, I think really it should like get people to go, something's wrong here.
Well, with the Protestant thing too, there are 6 Protestants who helped write the new Mass. And there's a nice picture that you can find online of all of them posing with Paul VI.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there were, I don't even remember how many different Protestants attended Vatican II. There were quite a few, actually. But this is something that the Vatican is not even hiding either. And that's another important thing. This isn't some crazy thing we're like bringing up that's supposedly being hidden, and that the Vatican openly promotes these things. And I just loved all the times, especially early in Francis's fake pontificate, where he would say something and the Vatican press would actually try to tone it down for the press. But then Francis would go back and insist, no, this is what I said. And it was obviously the more radical thing. That they're not trying to hide this stuff. It's right out in your face.
I think people will be surprised, still getting on the point that you're talking about, not going off on tangents. I think people would be surprised if they've read, read some older encyclicals like Mortalium Animus. You'd be shocked that the character, attitude, and the teaching that is being said there would be, it's totally rejected by these fake people.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I believe it was Mortalium Animos that, of course, for those who don't know, the encyclical Mortalium Animos was written by Pope Pius XI, and it very systematically condemns the idea of false ecumenism. Pretty much everything Vatican II does with ecumenism is directly condemned. And that was something that the people who created this new religion at Vatican II knew. But I believe even they didn't have an answer for it, that some of the modernist theologians were asked how these documents of Vatican II didn't completely contradict Mortalium Animos, and the answer given was that it would be up to future theologians to show the harmony between these two different documents. that it's so stark, even they couldn't come up with a good excuse for it.
I've heard. I know we're getting a little bit into the politics, but I've heard. I don't even think they would even go that. I think now they would just. I've heard people. Somebody would say something like, "Well, it's not as authoritative as a ecumenical council or whatever. So whatever he was said in that Morton Anonymous it's a whatever now because we got this whatever." But so that's kind of like thing that they would. I've heard people say like, "Well, that was an encyclical, so but not this is an ecumenical council." But truth is truth, and so if an encyclical is part of the ordinary magisterium, which is infallible. So it's not like they're like pitting two things against each other. But I've heard them even use this. They have this notion of infallibility or the what's the word the authorities that the church provides or the teachings. They have these like different tiers, and they just come almost like, well, we can reject this now because this has come. I don't know if you've heard things like that.
Yeah. Well, it's ridiculous because the dogmas and doctrines of the Catholic faith can never change.
Right.
And that is a very drastic change. That you're saying that for 1960 years or so that the church condemned as mortally sinful the idea that if you worship with false religions and you die in that state, you're going to go to hell. That's what the church always taught. Now you're saying that such a thing is not only allowed, but is to be encouraged. Because that's one good proof that the Novus Ordo is not the Catholic Church. Is the Novus Ordo doesn't even claim to be the one true church established by Christ. Nor does it claim that you have to belong to it in order to be saved. The idea of converting people has been long thrown out the window. That people are told instead to, if you're a Muslim, be a good Muslim. If you're a Buddhist, be a good Buddhist. I've always wondered how that's supposed to work, because if you think, take the Muslims, for example, you're supposed to be a good Muslim. What exactly is that supposed to entail? Does that mean you follow the Quran exactly? Because if it does, that means you should be cutting all the Catholics' heads off. It's total lunacy.
It is lunacy. So those when it comes those are the things those are one of the things that I tend to bring up if I'm going to not go off on tangents and kind of focus on a particular thing, is the idea of false ecumenism and showing how that is. They've changed their concept. They've changed what it is on faith and morals in that regard, because it's considered apostasy by Pius XI, at least an active apostasy.
Right, so, you're rejecting the Catholic faith entirely by doing so.
One of the things you mentioned too, I thought was interesting in your article for Sedevacantist Apologists, is to get, you said at point 12 was to get ecclesiastical approval and or counseling.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think especially for people who do have bigger plans, like different programs they want to start or different projects, that it is very good to get the approval of one's own parish priest or bishop. And I know that's one a lot of people will not like the idea of at all. But when it comes to Catholic action, that's something that was in fact always required in ordinary times. That you see whenever the popes speak about Catholic action and the necessity of having it, that there always is mentioned in there somewhere that it is to be done under the ecclesiastical authority. Because especially when it comes to things like matters of the faith and that the average layperson does not have the knowledge that a priest does, because they have not went through a seminary training of studying for years and years the principles of dogmatic and moral theology and canon law and all that. Yeah. And that's why it's good to get the advice and the help of a priest, as well as to have someone making sure that you're not doing something that's either going to be harmful or imprudent. That it's an area where too often for lay people, the aspect of pride can come in, that the kind of the general aspect of no one's going to tell me what to do. I think it's also an important one to mention that us priests ourselves, that we look to our fellow priests or fellow traditional bishops for advice as well. That too often I think the objection made to this whole thing is, well, what if the priest is wrong? Because I find too often, because of what's happened at Vatican II, where almost all the bishops and priests of the world left the faith, that people have lost trust in the clergy, which is perfectly understandable given the circumstances, as well as some of the more unfortunate circumstances that have come up in the traditional movement over the years. But nevertheless, that people should still look to priests and bishops that are good, very clearly good and clearly teaching the Catholic faith for guidance. Like I said, we're also looking to each other, making sure that we have each other's back as well, to make sure we don't go off the deep end and do crazy stuff.
Father, I think we pretty much hit. And for one way or another, I think we've hit all your points in this article. In the conclusion of your article, there was something I thought was interesting. I hadn't. You mentioned Pius the XII. Pius the XII. I don't know if it's a letter or what it was on. Let me look at it here.
Yes,
it's on,
his 1957 address, Guiding Principles of the Lay Apostolate.
Tell us about that. I went to read it. I haven't, but it sounded kind of interesting. What was your point in mentioning that, and maybe tell us a little about it?
So it was an address, so a public, I might say, speech or that given by Pius XII in 1957, kind of telling people some of the principles they should follow for when they participate in Catholic action, as well as going through the necessity of Catholic action, that there is a need for people to do what they can to help bring others to the true faith, even if it's just by their prayers and sacrifices. And of course, as I always point out, setting a good example, because your example will do far more than your words to bring people around. But so it's a particular address I'd recommend. One of the ones I'd recommend people who are especially very big in this area of trying to help people in the traditional movement to read. Another good book I'd recommend is The Soul of the Apostolate. Another very famous book. I believe it's one that was very highly praised by Pope St. Pius X.
Soul of the Apostolate. Father, I think that'll cover what I wanted to talk about from your article. But so when I was reading it, I thought it kind of, when I first reading it several months ago when I got the magazine, I was like, I think this would be important. I'm online. I discuss these things, and I'm doing this channel. I thought, man, this would be kind of fun to talk about with you and help reinforce my own mind too. And if I have to be doing this. Anyway, so I'm glad that you were willing, come on and discuss this. I appreciate it. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, or if there's something that's on your mind that we didn't address.
I think we addressed all the main points. Like I said, I'd recommend people to read the article if they haven't. Not because I'm trying to get some self-promotion, but simply because I think the points are very necessary to go over. And I think, like I was kind of alluding to earlier, that we do need everyone's help. That there are so many millions of people who are trapped in the Novus Ordo, millions who are trapped in Protestants or pagan religions. And so we do need everyone to do their part. like I said, primarily prayer and sacrifice for the conversion of sinners, but then being ready to help lead others to the faith when that opportunity arises. Like, it doesn't even have to be online. It could be a family member or even someone you run into that is interested when they hear you're a traditional Catholic. To be
I
ready
get that.
to help those people when those opportunities arise.
Occasionally I'll get that because people know I'm Catholic at work. They don't understand the nuances of different things, but they're like, "Oh, you're Catholic. What do you think of the Pope?"
Right. And that's a perfect opportunity to very simply, but very succinctly show that.
Yeah. That's almost a very common thing I hear. "Oh, what do you think of this Pope?"
When I find it interesting that not all the time, but in many instances, sometimes it is the Protestants or non-Catholics who actually grasp what we're saying quicker because they haven't grown up in that environment. That at times it can be easier for them to see, like, oh yeah, if the Catholic Church teaches this, then clearly this guy isn't a Catholic because he's not teaching that. In fact, he's teaching the opposite. But there are many instances where that they can sometimes see it a bit better. Not always, but that I have seen that particular thing happen on numerous occasions.
Father, do you have any other articles coming up or no? Or is that like a...
I mean, I have one I'm kind of half working on.
Okay.
My writing ends up being fairly sporadic because, like I said, I teach school here in Middleville throughout the week, Tuesday through Friday, but then on Sundays and Mondays I'm traveling, so it ends up being on a bit of an when I have time basis.
Sure.
And I'm also kind of famous for starting projects and unfortunately not finishing them because I'll get writer's block really bad and then I don't get back to it for a number of months. So I don't think there'll be any out in the immediate future. I have several different ones planned or
Sure.
at least have the thought process for. Not on this particular topic, but on others. I've written several articles in the Reign of Mary before on, I guess, fairly random topics. I know I wrote one on cremation, on why it's forbidden by the church, and one showing the various errors against the church's doctrine on the Holy Eucharist and why they're totally false. But so it ends up being a somewhat sporadic thing for me. I like to write, but like I said, I also get writer's block very easily. It takes me forever to think about how I want to write it.
Yeah.
I'll have a great idea in my head, but then when I go to write it, I either forget it or I also have the issue that I never learned how to type, so I can't type very well. So I go so slow at it that I forget what I was going to say by the time I get that far, or specifically how I wanted to word it.
I think for me, it's easier to talk than it is to write down my thoughts, I think.
Well, sometimes I'll use the dictation thing on for like Microsoft Word and just talk and make the computer write it. It's just I have to be very careful going back to check it, as it doesn't always pick up what word I said.
All right. Great, Father. Thank you very much. I just want to plug in, for people who don't know, to get these Reign of Mary magazines. They're not even expensive. I can't remember how much. I think it comes out maybe
comes out four times.
Four times each season. They usually send one out, and you can do back orders. I think they're really good. I've been wanting to recommend these for a while. So that's one of the, I just think it's good. It's primarily like CMRI priests. I don't. Occasionally, maybe they get some others, but lately I've seen it's pretty much it's a CMRI magazine. So I think most of the priests, pretty much all of them that write in here are from the CMRI.
Right. I mean, there's been a few times throughout the years where we've gotten permission to repost like an article, say from Father Cicada, or sometimes you'll have articles from Novus Ordo Watch, or but most of the time it is ones that are written by CMRI priests.
Right. Yes. I have seen stuff from Novus Ordo Watch, some of their articles being republished in here and things like that. And then it gives you kind of a good idea of like where the chapels are, and it has like pictures of, of what they've had going on throughout the year. A lot of good stuff. Anyway,
Yes.
Father, thank
I
you
was
very much. Yeah, thank you very much for doing this. It's been fun. It's fun kind of talking with you. So
thank you very much. I'm glad I was able to come on.
yeah, it was great. I'm gonna end the recording now, but just stay on, just for a minute.
Yep.